There are losses that crack the soul in ways words cannot fully explain, and for Kirk Franklin, a man whose entire existence has been built on the power of words, this truth arrived in the most heartbreaking way possible. All his life, he has been the one who stood before millions and turned their pain into praise, their heartbreak into healing, and their silence into song. He has been the anchor, the encourager, the voice that reminded people they were not alone in their darkest moments. But this time, when tragedy crept into his own family, it was Kirk himself who was brought to his knees, struggling to breathe through a grief that hit deeper than anything he had ever survived. The death of his nephew was not just a personal loss, it was a collision of past wounds, present heartbreak, and unresolved generational pain that had lived inside his family for years. It was a moment that forced Kirk to confront not only his sorrow but the cracks in his own heart that he had spent a lifetime trying to heal. And when he finally gathered the strength to speak about it publicly, what came out was not the polished confidence of a gospel icon, but a man trembling beneath the weight of emotions he had tried so long to suppress. Kirk Franklin has always been honest about his past, his struggles, his battles with identity, abandonment, trauma, and forgiveness. He built an entire ministry on transparency, openly admitting the scars that shaped him. But even with the darkest parts of his story revealed to the world, nothing prepared him for the moment he received the call that his nephew was gone. The young man had been wrestling demons of his own, demons that too often go unnoticed in families, overshadowed by reputation, responsibility, and expectations. And when his life was cut short, Kirk's world froze. He spoke about it for the first time with tears rolling down his face, his voice breaking in ways that startled even his closest friends. He said it felt as though someone had reached into his chest and crushed something fragile, something he didn't know could still break. He was just a kid, he whispered. He didn't deserve to go like that. And in that moment, the world saw a different side of him, not the energetic performer jumping across stages, not the bold leader shouting truth into microphones, not the award-winning producer with hits that shaped an entire generation. This was Kirk the uncle, Kirk the wounded. Kirk the man whose heart had been ripped open by a tragedy too painful to fully comprehend. This loss did not happen in isolation. It touched every part of his life, every part of his ministry, every part of his faith. It brought back memories of the broken family he came from, memories of a childhood shaped by rejection, confusion, and abandonment. He began to reflect on how cycles of pain follow families for generations when they are never confronted, never healed, never spoken aloud. His nephew was one of those cycles. A young man born into a world already carrying the weight of family wounds he did not create. A boy who desperately needed stability, guidance, and love, things Kirk himself had struggled to find in his own youth. For years, Kirk tried to be present. He tried to support the young man, to guide him, to offer moments of mentorship in between the demands of fame and ministry. But as he admitted in one of his most vulnerable confessions, "I was not there enough." Those words shook the gospel world because they came from a man known for speaking strength into others, now openly admitting that he had failed someone he loved. He said there were signs he missed, calls he didn't return fast enough, visits postponed, conversations avoided because he was too busy holding the world together, and that guilt, it consumed him. He said it felt like a shadow that followed him everywhere, whispering what ifs and if onlys into his spirit. Yet even in that darkness, he also found clarity. He realized that families often stay silent about pain, brushing off emotional wounds because they cannot be seen. He realized that young men often hide behind anger because they don't feel safe showing fear. He realized that families sometimes fail each other simply because they don't know how to show up in the ways that matter most. This tragedy forced him to see the truth he had ignored, that pain, when unaddressed, does not disappear, it grows. It grows until it swallows people whole, and his nephew had become one of too many swallowed by the quiet storms of life. As news of the young man's passing spread, Kirk was flooded with messages from people around the world, messages of love, condolences, and prayers. But he said none of it eased the ache in his chest. Because condolences cannot resurrect conversations that never happened, nor can prayers rewrite regrets. He knew that healing would take more than time. It would take honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the parts of his story he had tried to bury. During a service shortly after the tragedy, Kirk attempted to speak about it publicly. But as soon as he opened his mouth, his voice cracked. He paused, closed his eyes, and placed a hand over his heart as if trying to steady himself. The silence in that room was heavy. For the first time in his career, there were no jokes, no energetic outbursts, no clever metaphors, just raw pain. He spoke about how life can break people long before the world ever notices. He spoke about young men who slip through the cracks because society teaches them to be strong instead of honest. He spoke about the importance of compassion, listening, and creating safe spaces for broken people to heal. "We quote scripture," he said, "but we forget to love." Those words echoed across the sanctuary, like a plea, like a confession, like a revelation he himself had just discovered. People wept, not because they understood his specific loss, but because they recognized the truth in it. Families lose members every day, not just to violence, or illness, or tragedy, but to silence. And Kirk wanted to break that silence. He wanted the world to understand that ministry leaders are human too. They bleed, they break, they carry regrets, they face storms that fame cannot shield them from. Behind the scenes, those close to him said he struggled more than he let on. He would sit alone for long stretches, staring at photos, replaying conversations, trying to understand where things went wrong. He would question God, question himself, question the choices he made as an uncle, as a mentor, as a man. Yet through all that pain, he also began to rediscover something he had forgotten: grace. Not the kind he preached about in songs, but the kind you have to apply to your own soul when the guilt tries to suffocate you. He realized that love is not measured by perfection, it is measured by presence, and though he could not change the past, he could change how he lived moving forward. He vowed to show up differently, for his family, for young people struggling silently, for men in ministry who hide behind their titles while drowning in their own emotional wounds. This tragedy reshaped him, it softened him. It stripped away layers of performance and left behind a man who no longer cared about appearing strong. He said, "Faith isn't pretending it doesn't hurt. Faith is trusting God while it does." Those words became the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one built not on the spotlight, but on sincerity. And as the gospel world rallied behind him, praying for him, supporting him, sending love his way, Kirk found himself standing again. Not because the pain was gone, but because he understood that grief does not disqualify faith. It deepens it. But this was only the beginning of the story. Because the truth behind his nephew's death, the circumstances, the struggles, the emotional history, held secrets and heartbreaks the public had not yet heard. And when Kirk was finally ready to open up about those deeper layers, what he revealed would shake the foundation of everything people thought they knew about his family, his past, and the battles quietly raging beneath the Franklin legacy. The days following the tragedy were some of the quietest moments in Kirk Franklin's life. The world around him kept moving: music releases, church services, interviews, obligations, but inside his home, silence settled like a cloud that would not lift. His family gathered close, holding on to each other with the kind of heaviness that makes even breathing feel like a chore. Pictures of his nephew sat on tables and shelves, each one a reminder of a smile that would never return, a laugh that would never echo through their gatherings again. Grief doesn't knock before it enters, it barges in, rearranges everything, and leaves people trying to understand how the world continues when theirs has shattered. For Kirk, who had already walked years of emotional battles, this loss cut deeper than wounds he had barely survived in his youth. His nephew was more than a relative, he was a mirror of the boy Kirk once was: lost, confused, hurt by life before he ever had the tools to navigate it. Kirk saw in him the same shadows that had followed him through childhood, the same fractured relationships, the same longing for belonging that had defined his early years. And that realization broke him in ways he struggled to explain. His nephew wasn't just a young man trying to find his path. He was a young man fighting against generational pain, pain Kirk himself had tried to free his family from for decades. When he spoke privately to close friends after the funeral, his words were steeped in sorrow and reflection. He said his nephew had been carrying weight that no child should ever have to bear. He said he often saw flashes of brilliance in him, creativity, humor, passion, but also glimpses of deep frustration and emotional exhaustion. The young man had grown up in a world where expectations towered over him like mountains he was never taught how to climb. Being connected to a family so deeply rooted in ministry, fame, and success brought pressure most people will never understand. There is a different kind of silence that comes with being related to someone famous, a silence that often hides loneliness and fear, and Kirk knew that silence too well. The relationship between them had always been a mixture of love, distance, and longing. Kirk had tried over the years to guide him, but life's demands often pulled him away. Tours, recording sessions, business meetings, church commitments, his schedule was a constant race. And while he was encouraging the world to heal, his nephew was quietly unraveling. That reality became one of the most painful truths Kirk had to face. He said he should have checked in more, listened more, insisted more, been present more. But guilt is a cruel storyteller, it exaggerates regrets and erases the moments that were good. Even in his mourning, Kirk had to remind himself that he did love him, that he did try, that he did show up in the ways he understood at the time. Yet grief does not respect reason. It doesn't care about the logic of memory, or the complexity of family dynamics. It washes over a person like a tide, strong enough to knock them off their feet. And Kirk was swept into a tide that brought him face to face with emotions he had kept buried for years. Memories he thought he was healed from resurfaced without mercy. He remembered the nights he cried alone as a child, the times he felt invisible, unwanted, dismissed. He remembered the confusion of growing up in a broken home, the struggle of not knowing where he belonged. All those emotions that he had spent years transforming into music returned, this time wrapped in grief for his nephew. He said the loss forced him to confront the truth he had tried to ignore, that trauma does not disappear simply because a person succeeds. Fame does not erase emotional wounds, ministry does not cure generational dysfunction. Awards do not silence the brokenness that families pass down when they never acknowledge the depth of their hurt. The tragedy became a mirror, reflecting not just the pain of losing his nephew, but the work still needed to heal the Franklin family legacy. When news spread to the public, the gospel community responded with a wave of love and support. Artists, pastors, fans, and friends sent prayers, messages, and tributes. But Kirk remained quiet, retreating into a space of reflection. He said later that grief is a personal thing, and though he appreciated the support, he needed time to sit in the silence, to let himself feel rather than perform strength. For years people had looked at him as the symbol of resilience, the man who always found beauty in broken places. But now he needed to be broken without expectation, needed to be vulnerable without carrying the weight of inspiring others. The funeral service was intimate, filled with tears and memories that painted the story of a young man who had been loved deeply but struggled quietly. Kirk sat near the front, head bowed, shoulders shaking as he tried to process the reality that this chapter had closed far too soon. He hugged family members tightly, held his nephew's mother as she wept, and stared for long moments at the casket that held a piece of his heart. People who attended later said it was one of the most emotional services they had ever witnessed. There was no choir singing loudly, no grand speeches, no dramatic gestures, just raw humanity. At one point Kirk attempted to speak. He stood up slowly, wiping his face with a trembling hand. His voice cracked before he even said the first word, and for a moment he nearly sat back down. But then he took a deep breath and spoke softly, his words filled with the kind of honesty that only loss can birth. He said his nephew was a reminder that people can look strong on the outside and still be breaking on the inside. He said families have to do better at listening to each other, checking on each other, creating safe spaces where pain can be expressed instead of hidden. He said young men, especially young black men, need love, guidance, and emotional support more than they need judgment or comparison. As he spoke, the room grew silent. People listened not to a celebrity, but to a grieving uncle whose heart had been torn open. His message wasn't polished. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't rehearsed. It was messy, vulnerable, human, and that humanity touched everyone in the room. Many cried openly, including men who rarely showed emotion in public. In that moment, grief became a teacher, revealing truths people often avoid in the rush of life. After the service, Kirk stayed behind long after the room emptied. He sat quietly, staring at the last photo he took with his nephew. Friends approached him gently, offering comfort, but he remained mostly silent. Pain often speaks in silence, and his was loud enough to choke the air around him. He later said that grief is not something a person gets over, it is something they learn to carry. And he was learning slowly and painfully how to carry his loss without letting it consume him. In the weeks that followed, he began to open up more about the deeper layers of the tragedy. Not publicly at first, but privately, in conversations with counselors, pastors, and close friends. He said his nephew had struggled with more than external circumstances. There were internal battles, emotional storms, unresolved hurt, and confusion that the family had not fully understood. He revealed that the young man had distanced himself at times, pulling away from the people who cared because he felt unworthy of love, unworthy of belonging. And Kirk knew that feeling all too well. It was the same feeling that haunted him for years before he found purpose. This realization ignited something inside him. A desire not just to mourn, but to prevent other young men from slipping through the cracks. He began praying differently, thinking differently, approaching ministry differently. He made it a mission to create spaces where emotional and mental health could be discussed openly. He said the church cannot continue to ignore mental struggles, cannot keep preaching strength while dismissing the reality of pain. Faith, he insisted, is not the opposite of mental health, it is the anchor that helps a person navigate it. The loss of his nephew shattered him, but it also awakened him. It made him more intentional, more compassionate, more aware of the silent battles people face. But as he dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding his nephew's death, he uncovered truths that wounded him all over again, truths about family dynamics, truths about generational hurt, truths about cycles that had never been broken. And the more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this tragedy was not random. It was rooted in a history that had gone unspoken for far too long. What Kirk discovered next would not only reshape the way he viewed his family, it would force him to confront the ghosts of his own past in ways he never imagined.